Testing. Testing. Testing one.
This hearing for the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the U.S. response to the political crisis in Sudan. Let me just thank everyone here for your patience. I am sorry that we're starting so late. I know you are aware that votes were called, which means everything stops around here and we had to go vote. But I don't believe that we will be interrupted any further. Today we are here to further explore the fluid situation in Sudan, the potential for a successful transition to a civilian-led government, and the policy options available to the United States. Sudan is at a critical junction and must decide if it wants to continue on the path of former leader Bashar or transition to a civilian-led rule as the Transitional Military Council as promised. Initially, when the TMC seized power, they opened the political space and met with civilian-led groups. The organized protests were led by Sudanese professionals, the Sudanese Professional Association, made up of doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, and others. In January 2019, the SPA joined with other civil society organizations and political coalitions to sign the Declaration of Freedom and Change. This commitment to a peaceful struggle targeted broader goals, including ending al-Bashir's rule, forming a transitional government, ending violence against protesters, and restrictions to freedom of speech and expression and accountability for the crimes against Sudanese citizens. But the situation has deteriorated. I look forward to hearing more from our witnesses regarding the U.S. response to the political crisis in Sudan and how the U.S. can address these blatant human rights violations and support efforts to get the country on the path toward democratic representative governance. So without objection, all members have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. So I want to thank our distinguished witnesses who are here with us today for this hearing. I know that your staff have come to the Hill multiple times to keep us informed about events in the country, but the time has come to really understand how the U.S. is engaging the country during this political crisis. Let me say also that this is the first hearing. We anticipate having additional hearings. We did this very quickly, which is why we have one panel, which is a government panel. Usually we have more than one panel, and that we always include people who are from the country, but we weren't able to do this on quick notice. So I don't want you to think that this is the last time we are going to have this discussion, nor do I want you to think that we intentionally excluded people who are from Sudan. So there are many of us here in Congress who pay close attention to what is happening in Sudan. Considering all of the recent events in the country, the increased insecurity and the increasing human rights violations, we think it's critical to get this update on events in the country, how the U.S. is responding, and how the U.S. is adjusting its policy based on this new space the country is in. So I'd like to know about the Assistant Secretary's trip to the country, the role of the new Special Envoy, how has the UN drawn down affected humanitarian operations, and about the drawdown of personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum? Do you expect additional ordered departures? Are staff who remain in the country safe? I will tell you that several of us were planning on traveling to Sudan next week, and our trip was canceled because we were told that it was not safe to be in the country. Members of Congress from both sides of the aisle are engaged on Sudan, and we want to make sure that we have a strong, unified message to help citizens of Sudan realize their goal of a civilian-led transition to power. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you for convening today's hearing on the ongoing political crisis in Sudan, a political crisis which has urgent and broad humanitarian and human rights implications. On several occasions, both you and I have visited Sudan, including trips to Darfur, and we have also come, and we do believe that the people of Sudan deserve better. We have also come to understand the country's importance as a critical link between North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Horn, and how what happens in Sudan has implications for other countries, including, and in particular, South Sudan, which you and I visited together in June of 2017. Thus, today's topic extends beyond a single country. It also extends beyond a single crisis. Indeed, for most of my nearly 40 years in Congress, Sudan has been in political crisis. Today's pattern of repression followed by protests, followed by coup, followed by suppression, is a pattern we saw play out throughout much of Sudan's modern history, including in 1964 and in 1985. Counting the removal of longtime strongman Bashir this past April by the military, there have been some 5 coups since independence in 1956. It is thus hard not to think of a political crisis when one hears the name Sudan. For those of a certain age, Hollywood has even kept alive the Sudanese political crises of the 19th century. We all remember Charlton Heston depicting General Gordon on the big screen, and some 5 remakes of the adventure story Four Feathers, depicting the revolt of the Mahdi. Such depictions, though sensationalized and dramatized, nonetheless have some value, for that late 19th century movement of the Mahdi reverberates today, with much of the Sudan's modern history being intertwined with the question of how a modern state interacts with political Islam. Today's hearing also underscores the involvement of this subcommittee, which since 2005 has held roughly a dozen hearings. I've chaired them, you've chaired them, Madam Chairwoman, and my good friend, the late Donald Payne, did it as well. This subcommittee has also been engaged in the question of sanctions relief for a regime that has been a state sponsor of terror. Whatever the trajectory which began in the last administration and continued into this one towards lifting sanctions has been halted by events since last April 11th, when Bashir was removed from office by Sudan's military. That kindled in me a hope personally, for I had met Bashir in 2005 in Khartoum, and I found him to be absolutely inflexible in his opposition to any reform. All he wanted to talk about was sanctions relief in our conversation, which went on for well over an hour. I asked him if he ever visited, when was the first time he went to Darfur, Mr. President? There was no answer to that. I was on my way there right after that meeting. For a brief period this spring, we had hope that his removal would lead to a transition to civilian-led democratic government which respected human rights, and thus ultimately would lead to sanctions relief. But those hopes have been delayed, if not belayed indefinitely. On June 3rd, demonstrators who had kept vigil in Khartoum were violently dispersed, with some 120 killed. Thus, in the context for today's hearing, we shall hear from the administration witnesses as to what our policy response should be. Given the history of Sudan, what might we do differently this time to encourage a movement towards true civilian rule? While much of Sudan's history is intertwined with political Islam, from the Mahdist movement to the Muslim Brotherhood, there are also those committed to democracy and respect for religious freedom, including especially within the Muslim community. What can be done to encourage those individuals, parties, and countertrends? Further, what milestones must be met in a transition democracy and sanctions relief? We know the conditions which first the Obama administration and then the Trump administration set as preconditions for any relief, and that in that regard, I'm grateful that the Trump administration included respect for civil and political rights as important markers to be met, and for Deputy Secretary John Sullivan forcefully raising the issue of respect for religious freedom in the speech he gave in Sudan in November of 2017. What of holding Sudan to the terms it agreed to as part of the comprehensive peace agreement with South Sudan in 2005, including popular consultation with respect to South Kordofan, the Blue Nile states, and deciding the status of Abyei, terms which have never been fulfilled? Finally, how do we address the ongoing humanitarian crisis? It is estimated that the need for humanitarian aid has increased 40% since 2018, and the humanitarian crisis is linked to the political. While we work towards solving the political crisis, how do we meet the immediate humanitarian needs? No one should starve or have lack of medicine. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I want to introduce our 2 panelists now. Mallika James is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service and has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Africa and the Sudan since September 17, 2018. Prior to taking up these responsibilities, she was on the faculty of the National War College and served as the Director of the International Student Management Office at the National Defense University. Ambassador James has also held a variety of positions in Washington and overseas, including as the U.S. Ambassador to the Kingdom of Swaziland from 2012 until 2015. Ramsey Day serves as Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Africa Bureau. Prior to joining USAID in January 2018, Mr. Day was the Senior Director for the Center for Global Impact at the International Republican Institute, where he led the Institute's project design, strategic planning, and monitoring and evaluation efforts. He also worked in Amman, Jordan, as the IRI Country Director from 2014 to 2017, leading programs in public opinion research, good governance, and political party building. With that, Mr. Day.
Good afternoon. Chair Bass, Ranking Member Smith, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today alongside my friend, Mallika. USAID greatly appreciates the subcommittee's support for the people of Sudan and for drawing attention to this important issue. USAID remains deeply concerned over the brutal crackdown by Sudan's security forces on unarmed civilians who for months gathered peacefully in the streets of Khartoum and across Sudan, seeking to establish a representative and inclusive government after 30 years of oppression, division, and corruption under Omar al-Bashir. After decades of unwavering partnership between USAID and the people of Sudan, we are gravely concerned this nonviolent, well-organized, and massive effort by the Sudanese people to demand a democratic and representative government has been met with violence. United Nations human rights experts warn of Sudan sliding into a human rights abyss and have joined other voices calling for an independent investigation into violations against the peaceful protesters, which the Transitional Military Council, or TMC, has adamantly rejected. Darfur has still not recovered from the mass killing, mass displacement, and genocide that began in 2003, the aftermath of which USAID responds to with humanitarian assistance on a daily basis, and nearly 1.8 million people remain displaced by conflict and insecurity in Darfur, many of whom have been displaced for well over a decade. I remain deeply troubled that one of the key factors exacerbating the instability in Khartoum is the presence of the activity of the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, which evolved from the very forces that already committed mass atrocities in Darfur. As a show of good faith that it can operate in the interests of the Sudanese people, the TMC must allow for an independent and credible investigation of the human rights violations committed in Khartoum and hold accountable those responsible for the violence. On June 3rd, the TMC unilaterally announced that elections would be held in 9 months. USAID agrees with our State Department colleagues that such a timeline is unacceptable and would virtually ensure that the military and security forces who overthrew Bashir will remain in power, continuing the blatant violations of human rights and silencing of the peaceful demands of the citizens. The upheaval in Khartoum is also intensifying the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, just as the United Nations African Union Joint Peacekeeping Operation in Darfur, or UNAMID, is in the process of drawing down towards a planned exit a year from now. UNAMID continues to play an important role in the protection of civilians, and a role that simply cannot be filled by the RSF. The international community assesses that more than 8 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance in Sudan, including 1 million refugees, most of whom are from South Sudan. The United States remains the largest donor of humanitarian assistance in Sudan. Over the last 2 years, the U.S. government has provided nearly $340 million in humanitarian assistance, reaching more than 2.5 million people. Current programming focuses on emergency food distribution, improving health and nutrition, and increasing access to safe drinking water. The TMC's decision to cut off the internet and telephone networks has significantly hampered humanitarian operations. USAID will continue to call on the TMC to ensure unfettered access for humanitarians to help the Sudanese people in need of life-saving assistance. However, humanitarian access remains uneven and unpredictable. The reduced staff capacity of several Sudanese ministries and other government offices has, in some cases, slowed humanitarian access, but the operating environment varies greatly by location. The current restrictive and bureaucratic process for facilitating humanitarian operations must be improved to ensure timely delivery. USAID also provides approximately $5 million in development assistance to the Sudanese people, which supports conflict mitigation at the community level and bolsters civil society, including women, youth, and persons with disabilities. While we certainly have concerns about a rapid move to elections, USAID stands ready to support civil society to engage in a credible electoral process. The people of Sudan have been united by a vibrant, inspirational, and massive public demonstration for democracy and civilian rule, which has eluded the country since 1989. A transition to civilian rule with an empowered civil society, inclusive of all Sudanese, is essential to stopping the cycle of conflict and oppression and chart a new course for the people of Sudan and on their journey to self-reliance. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ambassador James?
Good afternoon, Chair Bass, Ranking Member Smith, members of the subcommittee. I'm really truly pleased to be here today to share the space with my colleague to talk about the situation in Sudan. I want to appreciate that this subcommittee and Congress as a whole has been very supportive in all of our efforts. We're all working towards a more peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Sudan. Since the ouster of Omar al-Bashir on April 11th, we've been in close contact with your staff to provide updates on the very fluid situation. I want to convey our very sincere appreciation for the strong bipartisan support for the statements surrounding the events on the ground. Our overarching policy goal in Sudan is to support the formation of a civilian-led transitional government that can begin to implement much-needed reform and prepare the country for free and fair elections. The Sudanese people have made their demand very clear. They want civilian leadership. We seek to help the Sudanese people avoid the many risks, such as continued military rule, a return to conflict among militias or security forces, and the reemergence of the National Congress Party and other political forces that seek to counter their aspirations. The reprehensible attacks by the security forces under transitional military council control and led by the Rapid Support Forces, beginning on June 3rd, sought to thwart those aspirations. However, the people of Sudan have shown remarkable resilience and determination in the face of this brutal violence. We should seek to similarly be undaunted in supporting their goals of a peaceful transition to a civilian-led transitional government that respects their human rights and fundamental freedoms. I personally visited Khartoum right after the Sudanese people unseated President Bashir, and I was moved by the passion, the dedication, and the commitment of the people to bring change, and I saw the protesters in the streets peacefully. On June 10th, the department appointed Special Envoy for Sudan, Ambassador Donald Booth, to lead the department's efforts to secure a peaceful political solution to the current crisis in Sudan. He and Assistant Secretary Tibor Naj recently traveled to Khartoum and Addis, and Ambassador Booth is currently in Khartoum today. We have repeatedly and at the highest levels, both publicly and privately, called for the TMC to end immediately all attacks on civilians, obstruction of medical care, blocking of the internet, and undue restrictions on the media and civil society. We have urged TMC leadership to withdraw the RSF from Khartoum and turn over law enforcement to the police as a way of demonstrating that they are ready to negotiate in good faith. The TMC is ultimately responsible for all the attacks on civilians by security forces, and we have pressed them to allow a credible and independent investigation and to hold those responsible for violence to account. To be clear, our previous engagement with the government of Sudan, known as the Phase 2 process, has been suspended indefinitely. Our hope is to help the Sudanese people achieve a civilian-led transitional government that respects their rights, and to then help that government, working with our international partners, to address the significant economic and political challenges it will inherit from the Bashir regime. We believe that an agreement between the Sudanese military authorities and the opposition umbrella group called the Forces for Freedom and Change, FFC, on the formation of a civilian-led transition is the best possible outcome. The FFC is broadly representative and committed to peaceful engagement. We've encouraged the parties to build upon the agreements made to date and to develop a transitional government system that is civilian-led, includes checks and balances, to promote consensus, and that will form a government within a reasonable amount of time, agreed to by all the parties before holding elections. Succeeding in this process will require compromise and courage from Sudan's leaders. We and other partners can play a very supportive role. Sudan's military also has a role to play as a partner in a civilian-led government. They can choose to be a partner in the solution, and agree with the FFC and form a civilian-led government and work with them in a transitional government that ends conflicts, implements reforms, and leads to free and fair elections. This is the only pathway to a stable Sudan and a better relationship with the United States. Lastly, we are coordinating with African and other international partners and stakeholders to align our efforts in support of a peaceful solution and a civilian-led government that heeds the demands of the Sudanese people. We support the role of the African Union and the strong response of the African Union Peace and Security Council following the bloody June 3rd attacks on peaceful protesters. We've also welcomed the engagement of Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy and the work of the envoy he has appointed, as well as the the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, to mediate between the parties in conjunction with the African Union. Ambassador Booth and other U.S. officials are in regular contact with the mediators to support their efforts, encourage productive dialogue leading to an agreement, and to back them with a full array of options at our disposal, including measures that target those involved in human rights violations and abuses and who undermine the establishment of a peaceful transitional government. We are coordinating with the African Union, the UN, our Troika, and other European partners and countries in the region, including important stakeholders such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. Senior officials have been engaged in a frank and frequent dialogue with them to coordinate efforts to send a common demand to the TMC to end attacks on civilians and to agree to the formation of a civilian-led transitional government.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony, and if there's more, I'm sure as we engage in questions and answers, we'll be able to do that. So we're going to begin that now, and we'll each take 5 minutes. We'll do a round, and then we'll come back through again if any of the members have more that they would like to say. Ambassador, you were talking about the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and I wanted to know if you could expand a little bit on your thoughts on what the role is that they're playing, because I know that it's not positive.
The United States has been having active engagement with all the countries that have a stake in what's going on in Sudan, including the Gulf states and Egypt on the crisis that's happening. We've had very frank conversations at the level of Undersecretary Hale, Ambassador Booth, myself, our Near East Affairs Bureau, and our embassies in the region. There was recently a meeting held just last weekend in Berlin, countries that are interested in Sudan. We called ourselves the Friends of Sudan, and we gathered, including the countries from the Gulf states, to talk about how we could be supportive and how we could work together.
Is it the administration's view that these three countries are playing a positive role?
Well, we do think that they can bring something to the table because they have influence and leverage with some of the parties. Particularly, there's leverage over the Transitional Military Council, and so we're urging them to use that leverage and to use the financial assistance that they have pledged to the country to move the TMC towards accepting an agreement and to ending violence. So to that extent, we think that they are receptive to that message. They have given us positive indication that they want to be supportive. And so, yes, we think they could play a constructive role.
They could play a positive role, but they have not up until now.
Well, I would say that we have urged them to be mindful of how their funds can undermine the process.
Right.
And they have indicated to us that the money that they have pledged to date has been used just to stabilize the Sudanese pound. But going forward, they want to work with the rest of the international community on how to continue dispersing those funds. So to that extent, they can play a more constructive role moving forward.
Okay. So what is the status of, you mentioned the effort by Prime Minister Abiy, and so what is the status of the Ethiopian and AU mediation efforts? I know when the Prime Minister first went there, if I'm not mistaken, or no, I'm sorry, when leaders of the opposition went to Addis, when they returned home, they were arrested. And I don't know where they are now, but I wanted to know what you thought of the Prime Minister's role in general and what happened to the opposition forces. Are they still incarcerated?
With respect to the general role that Prime Minister Abiy and his newly appointed envoy, Mahmoud Dardir, are playing, we think it's a very constructive role. Actually, they are working very closely with the African Union. The African Union has basically urged Prime Minister Abiy's envoy to take the lead in mediation. So we see a coming together of the African Union and the Ethiopian efforts including efforts with IGAD. It's been positive. It's been going in a direction where they have presented proposals to the parties, and we understand that the FFC has accepted that. The TMC has not. But that they are talking to all parties and trying to get this agreement signed. We think that's a constructive thing. We think it brings value. I actually have to say, I don't have the latest on the people who were arrested. We'll have to get back to you on that one.
Thank you. I would appreciate that. And then I wanted to know what support we are providing to the mediation efforts. You know, you certainly referenced Booth and the Assistant Secretary, but specifically, what are we doing? And then what tools do we have to press the TMC to hand over power?
Well, our very presence, the very fact that we have an envoy there, helps us play a coordinating role. The coordinating role I described with the Gulf states, as well as with other partners, many in the Troika, the US, UK, Norway, our engagement there, we're able to play a role where we are coordinating positions, we're putting forward ideas on how to assist the country once a civilian government is established. So we think our role has been very complementary and supportive of the envoy's role from the African Union and from IGAD. So we think we're playing our part. With respect to actual tools we have, I think Assistant Secretary Naj has spoken to this. We do have a wide array of tools. Some of them are to incentivize good behavior, and we're also exploring what happens if things don't go well. I don't want to go through chapter and verse now because we're in early stages, but we're looking at all options. The most important thing right now is we've got robust diplomacy. That's our first tool that we really want to put into full effect. With all the envoys now, with the ongoing dialogue that's happening, we think diplomacy is one of our biggest and strongest tools.
Let me, before I run out of time, I wanted to know what actions that we've taken to press for an impartial, independent investigation to some of the killings that have taken place. And I don't mean to exclude you, Mr. Day, but Ambassador, and then maybe in my last few seconds, Mr. Day can respond.
The killings were reprehensible, and I think from the very first day, we've issued statements from the State Department. We've also commended those statements coming from a number of other sources, including our European colleagues, our European partners, and the Gulf states. So we have been all encouraging everyone to release statements and to put pressure on the TMC. And our frank dialogue that we had in Berlin just this weekend, we underscore that everyone has to make it very clear to the TMC no more violence will be acceptable under any circumstances, and that there will be a cost to pay. I didn't want to get into the cost in great detail now, but we're looking at all options, including sanctions down the line, should there be any kind of repeat of violence.
Okay. Mr. Smith?
Hopefully those sanctions include indictments. I mean, Bashir, being the monster that he was, still was very concerned about his ICC indictment, so hopefully that's being very seriously considered. If I could, Assistant Administrator Day, if you could, you talked about how the rapid support forces witnesses said that they were formerly Janjaweed. Could you elaborate on that? And you did say, and I'm glad you were so emphatic, that we're fully against the May 13th decree by the TMC demanding that UNAMED bases are turned over to the RSF. And I'm wondering, you know, that's a 10,000 strong deployment, unless it's been downgraded further. I'm wondering what role they may or may not be asked to play in terms of peace. They're there, they're not far. You know, of course, Khartoum isn't Darfur, but if you could speak to that. And then the point you made in your opening about how credible reports that the RSF attacked protesters while they were sleeping, attacked medical staff in hospitals assisting the wounded, raped women and men, including healthcare workers, and then you go on from there. How safe is it now? I mean, has that been chronicled? I mean, do we know, what are those people doing? Someone who's been attacked in such a horrific way, did they find any kind of refuge, particularly the wounded? And what about a humanitarian worker on the ground right now in Khartoum or in proximity to it? How safe are they? And that goes for the medical staff as well. You mentioned one American was killed. Are you at liberty to disclose who that was, if you would? Was that person a humanitarian worker, for example? And again, I would ask you, how many of these RSF forces are there? I mean, you know, the Janjaweed wasn't all that big, but they were unbelievably lethal because of their monopoly on weapons and other things in space. If you could speak to that as well. And is there anything being considered at the United Nations in terms of a deployment of a force or redeployment of existing forces in Sudan?
Thank you, Congressman. There's several components of that I'll defer to the ambassador on, but I will comment on a few of those. Number one is related, to, of course, to the humanitarian situation and the role that the RSF is potentially playing in that. You're absolutely right. Many of the leaders of the RSF are the same leaders that were leading the Janjaweed militia during the Darfur genocide started in 2003. We're deeply concerned about that and how it will impact our ability to operate from a humanitarian perspective. The humanitarian situation is significant and it is serious. We have seen a significant increase in the humanitarian need over the last year or so, not just because of the political situation, but also the economic. 1 million of these are refugees from South Sudan, where USAID is reaching about 2.5 million people, but the operating environment is incredibly fluid. Where we have access one day, we may not have access on another day. So there are a lot of hydraulics at play. It's a very, very dangerous operating environment at the time. So one of the elements that UNIMID plays, you had mentioned UNIMID, is that it does provide some level of security in some of the areas in which we are operating. So it does play an important role. Any kind of transition from UNIMID bases to something that is controlled by the RSF is deeply concerning to us and absolutely unacceptable. On many of the other issues, I would defer to the ambassador.
You don't mean that they get involved with mitigating the violence. You mean that they would lose their base?
They would not play a constructive role. Absolutely not.
First thing I would add is that the RSF is under the TMC, and the TMC is ultimately responsible for all the violence that's happening in the country. So we've made it very clear that we expect the TMC to have the RSF removed from Khartoum. They are a force that's operating without control, and they need to be removed from that area. We've also said there will be accountability, and that there should be accountability for the June 3rd violence, and that we expect an impartial and credible investigation. So we're holding the TMC for the violence of the RSF. They're not a separate entity unto themselves. The other thing you asked about with respect to an American who was killed, I'm not aware of an American who was killed, though. I'm aware of an American who was shot and who was in the hospital. And when Assistant Secretary Naj and Envoy Don Booth were traveling, they visited him in the hospital. They personally engaged with him to assure him that these issues are of grave concern to us. But I don't think anyone was killed, but severely injured, and that's unacceptable as well.
Was that person a humanitarian aid worker or
I do not believe so.
Woman or man?
We could check on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Wright?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank both of you for being here. Mr. Day, you had mentioned the situation on the ground is dangerous, that operationally it's very fluid. Do we know, have we been able to has anyone been able to do a needs assessment? Do we know exactly what kind of supplies are needed there?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. We do believe the type of humanitarian assistance that we are providing is what is needed, which has been food distribution, which is the primary issue that we're looking at. Food security is incredibly important at this point. There are about 5.8 million people in Sudan that are in what we call IPC3 or IPC4 areas, which is either crisis or worse, emergency. IPC5 would be in a catastrophic situation. So there are significant needs, but it's really on the food security side, nutrition, and then as well as water and sanitation.
To what extent is the TMC preventing things like food and medicine to that extent from getting where it needs to be?
Historically, there has been interference or at least bureaucratic impediments in terms of getting permits to operate in certain areas. Since 2016, the humanitarian access has improved. However, I say that with some caution just because it is very spotty, it's very uneven, and it's very unpredictable. So we haven't seen any kind of systematic interference in our humanitarian access, but in some cases we just have more access than we have in other places.
Okay, well, would you go as far as to say that their interference, people are dying because of their interference, that food and medicine is not getting where it needs to be? Is it that dire?
The situation is dire, and there are people who are dying because of the food insecurity in Sudan. That said, the humanitarian operations are functioning. And we are in good coordination with other donors. So I don't know that I would go so far as to say that there has been systematic and direct interference by the TMC that has led us to widespread inability to get to where we need to go.
But their cooperation leaves a lot to be desired, doesn't it? Ambassador James, you've talked a bit about some other African nations and their involvement. I didn't hear anything about Russia and China. We know that they're meddling in Africa, Chinese in particular, all over Africa. Have you heard, do you have any knowledge that they're getting involved in Sudan?
I don't have anything specific to add on China in particular. We have certainly monitored Russian actions because the Russians were certainly involved with the Sudanese in some other African conflicts. And so we're keeping a close eye, but I haven't anything new to report to you today.
Okay, great. Madam Chair, I'd like to give the remainder of my time to the ranking member, if he needs it.
I am. Mr. Burchett?
Thank you, Chair Lady, Ranking Member. I was going through my questions here, and everybody seems to be sort of reading off the same sheet now, but I appreciate that. There's been reports that there are tensions between the Sudanese military and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. Should fighting break out between the security forces, what would that conflict look like? And both y'all can take a shot at it.
Well, Congressman, I started by noting that we consider the RSF an entity that the TMC must be accountable for and must control. We understand that there are some tensions. We've certainly seen it play out with respect to what happened on June 3rd. I think it's very clear that the RSF was at the fore of that. The RSF initiated that action. And so our pressing the TMC today is to say, you must hold these people accountable. You must rein them in. You must stop this continued violence. We're hoping that our pressing them collectively, not just the United States, but all of the international partners, pressing the TMC, that there's going to be accountability and there's going to be a cost if they don't rein them in, that will generate enough motivation for them to really move seriously. We have to watch. It's a very delicate situation. It's very fluid. Nobody wants to see more violence happening. So we've got to kind of take this in very carefully measured steps. But we have been making the point very clear to the TMC. You are responsible for what happens with the RSF. We have not allowed them to separate out and say they don't have control. They have to be accountable at the end of the day. That's our consistent and collective message.
And from USAID's perspective, we are in constant scenario planning mode, and in the event that there's a further deterioration of the security situation, we would be able to respond as necessary.
Okay. Thank you.
Are you finished?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh,
Yield
thank
the
you.
rest of my time. I apologize.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you. A few more questions. I wanted to ask again about Ethiopia and its role. And if there is an agreement based on the Ethiopian proposal, how could the U.S. and other partners ensure that key reforms are implemented to support a democratic transition? And then how will the U.S. respond if the TMC forms a transitional government without the opposition? How about you, Mr. Day?
Well, again, I'll defer to the ambassador on some of the political dynamics, but I will say in the event that there is a civilian-led government that is formed, and it's a government that we would want to work with, we are prepared, and we are in, as I mentioned, in constant scenario planning. So in the event that there is a civilian-led government that we would want to work with, we are prepared to adjust our assistance posture towards that government. So we're ready to go.
Well, I was describing if they formed a government without the opposition.
I'm sorry,
the military.
without the opposition.
Right.
So we will work with
What
our.
will we do? What will our response be?
So we will certainly work with our colleagues at the State Department to make a political analysis as to whether or not this is a government in which we can work. But in the event that we can work them, we're ready to go.
I think that was referring that to you, Ambassador.
Chair, I would like to just be very clear and unequivocal about this. we have conveyed in very strong terms that a unilateral government formed by the TMC would not be credible, would be unacceptable, and we would have a very difficult time engaging with such a government. We've
What do
also
you think
urged-
the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt would do?
Well, we've had frank discussions, as I said, this last week, as well as the previous contacts I've described. And they have said to us repeatedly, they too want to see a civilian-led government that is in their interest because they are fundamentally concerned about stability. Anything short of a civilian-led transitional government that has the consensus and the buy-in from the people will not provide the stability that they care about. So we believe them, we take them at their word that they want to see that they are sending those similar kinds of messages, and we urge them to continue to do that publicly, privately, and to use their leverage.
So are we doing anything to return internet access? I don't believe the internet is back, is it?
My understanding is that it's not back yet. We're very concerned about that. Of course, it affects not only messaging, but it also affects humanitarian assistance delivery. It affects a number of things.
Right.
We're very concerned about that. We have, again, been making that one of our clear messages to the TMC. You have to restore the internet.
So what are we doing to support then the human rights defenders, journalists, and civil society during this period? And when you say to them that they have to restore the internet, what is their response? Because they haven't done it.
Well, they have not done it. We can't, I couldn't tell you chapter and verse as to what they are doing behind the scenes. We haven't seen it, but they know that it's part of our broader messaging. If you do not allow the people to demonstrate peacefully, if you do not allow not just the internet, but media freedom, that all of this undermines credibility in the efforts to get a civilian government. We've been making the linkage that you cannot have a good faith process if you don't allow the people to be speaking and to be seen and to be able to demonstrate peacefully. So we've been simply reiterating this as part of our broader messaging to them that people have a right to peacefully
Do
protest.
you get a sense that they take us seriously? I mean, we don't have an ambassador, right?
We have a charge, and that's because they have a charge here. But our charge, Stephen Kudis, has been very engaged. He has regular meetings across the board with FFC and TMC and other stakeholders. So we think that we're getting our message across. We've actually seen some moderation. When I arrived in Khartoum in early April, one of the first demands was that the negotiators that the TMC had put forward were not credible. They were considered tainted, and we pressed that they had to remove them. The TMC did remove those people. And so we think that they do begin to hear us, but it's a consistent and it has to be a collective message from the broader international community.
So it just seems to me, I mean, you know, I was there a few months ago before this happened, and they were so excited and interested in moving U.S. relations forward, and they were all ears. And to me, it seems like that has closed. I don't get the impression that they are taking us seriously. If we have said over and over again they need to restore internet access, and they haven't, I don't know if we have any ability, technology-wise, to supersede that.
I couldn't answer on the technical issue of what we can do on the internet specifically, other than make it very clear that that is part of our broader demand for giving the public access to media and the ability to be heard and to be seen. In terms of our leverage, one of the most important bits of leverage we have, and I think the committee is quite aware, is that we were in discussions with the government prior to the fall of Bashir. We were in discussions under what we call Phase 2. That process has been suspended indefinitely. Right. The government is very much interested in resuming that because they see it as the ultimate path to getting to economic assistance.
Right.
And so that leverage is something that
They want
we
the
are
state
continuing
sponsor
to
of
press.
terrorism removed.
We are continuing to press that there will not even be a reassessment of starting that dialogue unless the civilian government is in place. So we think we have their attention because that's leverage that they really want us to exert in their behalf.
Thank you.
Thank you much, Madam Chair. Let me ask you, if I could, the makeup of the RSF. You know, the information I've looked at suggests that there may be as many as 50,000 troops. A man who goes by the name or the nickname of Hamedi, who is well known for his atrocities, and I'm wondering what we know about him. And I'm wondering if you could tell us how the Saudis and the Gulf states provide money. What is the flow of money, munitions, other material. Do they have any influence to try to end this reign of terror, since they seem to be the purse strings? But again, Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, I mean, could be misstated, who goes by the nickname of Hamedi, but 50,000 troops, is that accurate? Because that is a huge force. And are they at loggerheads with the military? Or are they in some way in cahoots with the military? If you could speak to that as well. Who in the RSF has been who are they targeting? I mean, when they went into the hospitals, when they raped men and women, when they killed people, what was their target? They must have had, it couldn't have been indiscriminate. They must have had people. Is there any sectarian violence involved here? Other Muslims, for example, or Catholics or others? Is there any evidence of that? I think that is important. And again, the Janjaweed leadership, how many of these people are newly recruited into this new force? The Janjaweed was notorious for its brutality. They never went away, and apparently they have reconstituted themselves under a new banner. If you could speak to that as well.
Let me start with Hamedi first. Hamedi is the deputy of the TMC. And in that position, he has a role of influence within the TMC structure. And so we engage with him, not to confer legitimacy, not because we believe that he is somebody who is a credible and a good leader, but because we have to engage with him to deliver our tough messages. So we do meet with him quite regularly as part of our engagement strategy to be sure that they are getting our messages loud and clear. With respect to the RSF, I couldn't answer your question yet on the numbers, but we all know the RSF are a remnant of they are a rebranded version of what was the Janjaweed. These are not people who we consider to be credible security forces, but we do feel like because they have been a part of the security force, the TMC has to rein them in and has to direct their behavior and has to be accountable for their behavior. But the RSF is quite a concern for us, very, very big concern. These are not disciplined forces, these are not trained security, and there is a great concern that the division between them and the regular army, the Sudanese armed forces, is very worrisome. Nobody wants to see a civil war break out, and so we're trying to convey to General Burhan, who is the head of the TMC, that he must be accountable for what is happening with Hamedi and the RSF. We cannot say that enough. And it's not just the United States. This is a point that all the countries involved in Sudan, including the members who were at the meetings on the weekend, the Gulf states, Egypt, Ethiopia, the AU, we've all been sending a similar message. The RSF must be reined in. They have the potential to destabilize what could be a successful transitional process, because they, of course, are worried about their future. So we've been repeating that message over and over to Burhan. He has to be accountable for what is happening with Hamedi and the RSF.
Is there any kind of graph that would show the line of authority with Hamedi and others, and how many of these commanders are seasoned Janjaweed who have committed the most gross atrocities on the face of the earth, and now they're unleashed again to kill fellow Sudanese? Do we have that? I mean, what is the core group that really makes up this terrible organization?
I don't have a definitive number for you today. We can do some checking on that. But I think it's accurate to say that they are widely dispersed throughout Khartoum.
Right.
They're in Omdurman, they're in other large cities. So they are in many different places. And we have urged that they be removed from the streets of Khartoum. They have no business in Khartoum. There are no barracks for them in Khartoum. And if they're going to be removed off the streets, they have to be totally decommissioned there. There's no place for them to go back into barracks in the Khartoum area.
Now, you've testified that AU has suspended their membership. Does that have any real impact? I mean, Bashir actually ran the organization during one cycle, and I'm just wondering if what else is on the table that could really impact them?
The point I was trying to underscore earlier about the robust diplomacy that's happening now, we're at a new moment right now. Between the envoy that the AU has assigned, the envoy from IGAD and from Ethiopia, and our own envoy, as well as the envoy from the United Nations and others, we see that there is now a consensus coming together. There is a core of diplomacy that's really beginning to have an impact. We're not only doing it in Khartoum, we're doing it in various other capitals, as well as in the Gulf states. Ambassador Booth will be traveling not only from Addis to Khartoum. He'll be going to the Gulf states this week coming. And so we're going to continue sending the message that we need to be coordinated and using all of our leverage. No one country alone can move this situation. It's going to take our collective activities, which is why we're spending a lot of time coordinating with our partners in any country that has influence and a constructive role to be played. So that's what's been happening. That's the real leverage. Using the diplomacy first because things are beginning to have a dent. You've got the FFC open to an idea that's been put forward from the African Union and the IGAD members, and that's something that we want to build on. We want to lock in what they've already agreed to and keep building on that and pressing the TMC to come to the table. It's not going to be an overnight process, but we have to keep the pressure up from all the different bits of leverage that we have. And many different members of the international community have different degrees of leverage. We're trying to bring it all together.
Thank you. Representative Omar?
Ambassador James, I wanted to talk to you about the role of foreign influence in the events of June 3rd. Particularly wanted to talk to you about Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arabs. I know that the administration sees the importance of engaging the Gulf states since David Hale called both the Saudis and the Emirates after the attacks. What do you think are the interests of Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt's objectives and interests in Sudan?
Well, the first thing I would say is that after the June 3rd violence, the UAE and Saudi government both issued statements, as well as Egypt and others, strongly condemning the violence. They took that action immediately, unprompted, and I take that to mean that they were shocked and appalled by the violence as we were. So I would give them some degree of recognizing that that was a horrific experience. It undermined the process that was going along, we thought, in a constructive way.
Right.
With respect to their interests, I would say that certainly they have a lot of long-term economic interests, but they also have an interest in fundamental stability. Any instability in Sudan is going to affect the whole region. They have raised that with us on several occasions. We take that to be a very serious concern. Instability in the region is something that's going to affect all the neighbors, and they have a stake in making sure that that instability does not spill over.
And Ambassador, do you think they have interest in democratization of Sudan? And do you know if Secretary Pompeo discussed Sudan with MPS in his meeting yesterday?
I do not have a readout on the Secretary's conversation, so I could not address that. But I would say they have the Gulf states have the same interest we have in terms of stability. And the best way to get that stability is to have the civilian-led government. They have said that repeatedly. They support that. They have made it very clear they do not support the TMC. They are not there for the TMC, but they engage with the TMC the way we engage to deliver tough messages. I take them at their word that instability cannot be addressed if you don't have a government that the people fundamentally will accept. That's why the civilian-led government has been all of our mantra. That's all the people are demanding. That's what the people want. They understand that's the route to stability.
And we know that the Saudis and the Emirates have had a history of crushing democratic uprising in the region. And so I'm wondering that is contrary to what our interests are or what we see as stability being driven by in the Middle East. How is Ambassador Booth going to bring them around to see things from our point of view?
Well, I start with the fact that I don't think we're pushing on such a closed door to begin with, because in the meetings I held just this weekend with senior officials, the basic message was that we all are in agreement. The civilian-led transitional government is imperative. It's imperative for the stability, but it's also the key to unlocking future economic assistance. That's what the country fundamentally needs. The instability in Sudan was driven by the economic crisis. They want to see the economic crisis addressed. We cannot address it until the state sponsors the terrorism issue is addressed. So stability is key for all of us. I think the Gulf states have that same interest. We're all moving in the direction of what will it take to get us there. That means we have to get a mediated process, which everybody will agree to, that will lead to a civilian government. I think the Emiratis, the Saudis are in the same position we are and wanting to see that happen sooner than later. It's the only guarantee to stave off the instability.
Yeah, and I know that the people of Sudan have fought really hard to make sure that they can get rid of a dictator, and I hope we do everything to make sure that they don't get a dictator for another 30 years. As you've mentioned that there might be possible sanctions down the road, to clarify, do you mean the global Magnitsky sanctions on Hamidi for his role on the June 3rd or something else?
Well, respectfully, I'd like to say that we haven't really finished that review process yet. We're looking at the options, but the options would include a range of things. As I said, there are some incentives, but there are also some sanctions. Everything from visa sanctions to economic sanctions. I think I would leave it in that broad category for now as we're still assessing what are the best tools. We want to use the right tool, and we really want to target the right people. So visa sanctions are certainly on the table, as are economic sanctions.
We often see different ways that we engage and the ways that we use our toolboxes. There are a lot of people who are talking to me about the way that we've engaged aggressively in the situation in Venezuela and how we are not engaging aggressively in the case of Sudan. And some people would say this is a country of brown people who are Muslim. We might not be interested in engaging aggressively because our allies don't want us to. And I hope that we are trying to find a balance and trying to be consistent with our values as we engage diplomatically in this particular issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Phillips?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And of course, today's conversation and hearing is not just about the future of Sudan and the Sudanese people, but also Ethiopia, which of course is host to hundreds of thousands of refugees, and even an issue that touches my district in the suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where one of the first questions asked in my recent town hall just last weekend was from a Sudanese immigrant who asked what we are doing to help the transition to an accountable form of government in his former country. So to that end, I can't help but reflect on the fact that we do not have an ambassador representing our country right now. Personnel at our embassy has been drawn down, and the UN is also drawing down personnel. So my first question to both of you is, under those circumstances, are we positioned to provide the assistance and support necessary, and how do those three things affect our ability to do so? Ambassador James.
Yes, sir. With respect to the ordered departure, our first priority always at all of our embassies overseas is the safety of our own people and those who work for us. Drawing down the embassy was a prudent measure to take in the early days, partly because the air travel was inconsistent. We would have no way to evacuate people, so we took an action based on the safety of our own people to draw down to just the essential core staff. The essential core staff that was working around the clock, and we're now trying to support them as hard as we can back in Washington. Ambassador Booth's appointment is to help with some of the regional diplomacy. So we do think that we've got a number of tools, the envoy, the embassy team, and then the robust group that we have back here in Washington. So we do think our work is still going forward. Yes, we'd like to be at full staffing, but the most important thing is the safety of the people who are there. We think we're at a reasonable number for the risk and for the work that we have to get done. So that's with respect to the ordered departure.
Mr. Day?
I would only add that I think we are well positioned in the event that there is a real political transition in Sudan. We have been working in Sudan for nearly 3 decades. We're the largest humanitarian donor. Our development assistance is quite limited, but at the same time, we do have a pretty significant network of civil society organizations that we've supported over the last several decades. We have made available some money through our elections and political processes fund, and we also are supporting human rights monitoring. So at this point, we feel like our assistance is probably appropriate for what the environment would allow. Again, separating humanitarian assistance and development assistance. But in the event that there is a political transition, we stand at the ready to adjust our assistance posture.
Okay, I appreciate that. My next question is about stolen assets and money laundering. Do you believe those issues are issues in Sudan?
I would have to say they absolutely are issues. We have not personally had the luxury of engaging on those deeply since April 11th, but we know that the FFC has been looking at the issue, and we've urged them to be transparent in whatever work that they're doing around that issue. But it's certainly something that a civilian-led government could take on. I think we're not going to get a lot of traction on that right now, but if we can get to a civilian-led government, I think it's something that we would urge them to put on their agenda.
As you know, the Treasury Department issues anti-money laundering advisories. On occasion, we've done so relative to Venezuela and Ukraine. Would you argue that we should be doing so with Sudan so that we can identify and track some of those assets?
To be quite honest, the priority right now is to really get the political process moving forward, to get the civilian-led government. That's the first thing. When that happens and we've got a responsible government in place, then we can do a lot of other things along the lines you're describing. But without a responsible government, I think it's just going to be so much more difficult, if not impossible. So our priority right now is really to make this diplomacy robust and to get the civilian-led government in place.
Okay. Mr. Day, any comments on laundering? Okay. With that, I yield my time.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just ask a couple of final questions. On December 28th, the New York Times, in an article on the front lines of the Saudi war in Yemen, child soldiers from Darfur, the point was made that on any given time, for nearly 4 years, there were some 14,000 Sudanese militia, mostly from Darfur, who really comprise the RSF. So child soldiers are deployed. They take part in that battle, then some, I guess, maybe many are returned. Is that what we're talking about in terms of the composition of those 50,000 RSF forces? Are we talking about child soldiers who are growing older, of course, but more battle-hardened, who have now turned their violence against Sudanese people? And again, if I could ask, do we have any sense as to how much money from the Gulf states is flowing to this transitional government? And will the Saudis and others do more to just put a tourniquet on the money and their diplomatic support for this terrible bloodletting? And again, thirdly and finally, does USAID have enough resources? I mean, we're talking millions of people again. Is there a need for an urgent supplemental, or is money being diverted from some other account to ensure that food, clothing, medicine, and shelter is provided for the victims?
With respect to the child soldier issue, I would note that Sudan has recently been relisted under Child Soldier Protection Act, which has consequences with it. It has sanctions attached to it. But of course, as they're already under SST sanctions, it doesn't trigger any new financial issues, but it is something that we will take note of, and the civilian government will have to address that. So they are relisted for the reasons you described. I would say that some of those comprise some of the RSF forces. I couldn't give you a breakdown, a real number, but we know that there have been forces deployed to Yemen, and that we have been concerned about that, and we've raised that.
Do we have any idea of what their cycling is? I mean, we all worry here, even in the United States, the UK, others, that when people were deployed, went to fight with ISIS, when they came back, posed a very real threat to the U.S. or name the country. Are these soldiers, upon their return, now obviously better trained in really barbaric behavior? Are they then, I mean, how many are we talking about, and are they disciplined? I mean, who are they?
I actually don't have a firm answer for what happens to the returnees. We can come back to you with
Could you provide that for the record?
But I would also like to answer your question about the money from the Gulf states.
Yes.
What we have been told repeatedly, we've had several interventions on this issue, the Saudis and the UAE government pledged a total of $3 billion over a 2-year time frame. They have indicated to us that they've each deposited $250 million into the Central Bank of Sudan, and that money is there to stabilize the pound, and it was not given to the TMC, and it's not against the people of Sudan, but it was to avoid a crisis, a fire as they described it. We have made the strong case to them that any additional disbursements of those funds should be done in coordination with the international community, one, to make it more effective and sustainable, and to use it to help a civilian-led government, which will need that assistance over time. So they seem to be responsive to those entreaties, and we hope that that's how they will disperse the remainder of that $3 billion.
Ranking Member Smith, I think on the issue of do we have enough resources, given the increasing need as well as the access issues, the humanitarian operations are fully functional. And so areas in which we can gain access, we have the resources that we need to address many of those issues. As the situation evolves, we may have to reassess as we go forward, because it was only a year and a half ago that we were at about 4.5 million in need of humanitarian assistance, and now we're at 8 million. So this is an extremely fluid situation, so we'll continue to watch this. We are also looking at other ways in which we may be able to support many of the people of South Sudan. We're looking at Office of Transition Initiatives programming. We're looking at ways in which we can continue to monitor the human rights issues. So there's a wide range of tools that we're using, but on the humanitarian assistance side, we're deploying the resources that we have available to us, but many of the restrictions are going to be more on the access side than they are the resources there. We can move resources from one place to another.
And before I run out of time, is there any serious consideration at the UN of redeploying or in some way constituting a force? I know it takes a long time to do all of that, but you know, my sense is that I don't have a great deal of optimism that peace is going to break out. So one of the contingencies should be, will there be a UN force ready for deployment?
To my knowledge, the UN Security Council has not taken this issue up yet, but the UN does have an envoy, a very capable envoy, Frank Haysom, who's been fully engaged in all the conversations with the other envoys, with the TMC, with the FFC. He's been in Khartoum quite a bit. He's engaged with us. We think the UN is clearly poised to take action, but it has not come to the Security Council. If I can add one other point that I didn't mention earlier, June 30th is close approaching. We're very concerned about the potential violence for June 30th. We have also been conveying very strong messages to the TMC that they must allow peaceful protests, that if there's any repeat of the violence that we saw on June 3rd, that there will be consequences, and that the people have a right to protest, because we are anticipating that there will be major activities on the day of June 30th.
And you think Hamedi gets that?
Well, we've been conveying that across the board. Certainly, we've been conveying it to Burhan and to others. We think that message is being repeatedly delivered by other partners as well. It's not just our message. It's the collective UN and international message.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your work under such difficult circumstances.
Sure, my pleasure. Just have a couple of final questions. I wanted to know if the U.S. is encouraging the TMZ to turn al-Bashir over to the ICC.
That hasn't been a topic of recent conversation. As you've seen probably in the media, he's had a hearing at the court in Khartoum.
Yes.
And I think that's where he stands right now. He's incarcerated in Khartoum, but there has not been an engagement on the ICC issue.
I wanted to know if you know of where the Speaker of the Parliament is. The Speaker that was in place last year, I don't know if there's a new Speaker, and other parliamentary leaders before the Bashir's removal. Are they still in place, or is Parliament not functioning at all?
My sense is that Parliament is not functioning, and there's certainly been a lot of people who have been removed from the office. I couldn't say the status of the Speaker per se. I really don't know that, and I'll do some checking. But
Could you find out for me?
Yes.
I would like to know where he is.
Thank you.
And Madam Chair, on that front, I would just add that on the public administration side, because of course USAID worked closely with the Humanitarian Aid Commission, many of those institutions have in many ways been either dismantled or completely sidelined. In some cases, the National Intelligence and Security Services have actually been, they were interfering in our ability to work with the HAC to get the permits that we needed. In an odd chain of events, the inability or the distraction of the NIST has actually enabled some of that permitting process to actually improve. It's still complicated in terms of the humanitarian access in certain areas, but in many cases, our interactions with the government of Sudan has been almost non-existent.
Thank you. The internet blackout, I just want to say in closing, the internet blackout we know is affecting most of the country's citizens and has now been turned off for what I believe is 21 days. Internet access, we believe, must be reinstated, and I urge those behind this to unblock internet access immediately. Governments must understand that prohibiting access does not mean that citizens will stop exercising their civil rights. I urge the government also to stop the censoring of print newspapers and stop detaining and harassing journalists, activists, and any citizen exercising their right to free speech and protest peacefully. Members of Congress from both sides of the aisle are very engaged in Sudan and plan to continue to do that. And we want to make sure that we have a strong, unified message to help the citizens of Sudan realize their goal of a civilian-led transition to power. As I mentioned when we started, this is a first hearing. This is not our last. I would appreciate it if you would pass the word to Ambassador Booth and Naj that we would like to have them come and speak to us, and we would like to do that very soon. When we have another hearing on Sudan, we will make sure that we have more than one panel, and there will be Sudanese who are represented in the future. I apologize we weren't able to do that this time, but assure you that this is not the last time that you will hear from us on this issue. Members of Congress, as I said, are very, very concerned about this and do not plan to let up. With that, this hearing is adjourned.